In the grand, sprawling mythology of rock and roll, we tend to focus on the gods, the flamboyant frontmen, the charismatic lead singers who command the stage, soak up the spotlight, and become the faces on the magazine covers. They are the singers whose voices we know, whose lyrics we memorize, whose stories of triumph and tragedy become the stuff of legend. But rock and roll is not a pantheon with a single deity. It's a gang. It's a sprawling, dysfunctional, beautiful family. And for every iconic frontman, there's a quiet figure standing just to their left or right, head down, lost in their instrument, who is the real engine of the band, the guitarist, the one who provides the fire, the soul, the grit. These are the unsung heroes, the secret weapons. They are the musicians' musicians, revered by their peers, but often unknown to the wider world. Their names might not be famous, but their sound is unforgettable. They are the architects of the riffs that get stuck in your head for days, the creators of the solos that make the hair on your arms stand up. And in the long, messy history of British rock, there are few figures who embody the spirit of the unsung guitar hero more perfectly and more tragically than Darrell Bath. If you were a fan of gritty, honest, hard-on-its-sleeve rock and roll in the 90s and 2000s, you've heard him play, even if you never knew his name. He was the six-string maestro behind bands like the Dogs d'Amour and the legendary UK Subs. He was a collaborator sought out by punk royalty. He was a man with the swagger of a 70s glam rocker, the snarl of a first-wave punk, and the soul of an old bluesman all rolled into one. He was by all accounts a genius, and yet when he died in 2021, there were no grand obituaries in the major newspapers, no lengthy tributes on the evening news. He passed away in poverty and obscurity, a casualty of the very rock and roll life he had so authentically embodied. This is the story of a man whose talent was immense, whose influence was profound, but whose name you probably don't know. It's the story of Darrell Bath, rock and roll's lost guitar hero. To understand where a musician like Darrell Bath came from, you have to transport yourself back to the Britain of the 1970s. It was a strange and volatile decade. The psychedelic optimism of the 60s had curdled, giving way to economic turmoil, industrial strikes, and a pervasive sense of national decline. The landscape was gray, the future looked bleak, and for a generation of working-class kids coming of age, there was a palpable feeling of boredom and frustration. The rock music of the day, dominated by progressive rock behemoths with their 20-minute solos and fantasy-inspired lyrics, felt bloated, distant, and completely disconnected from their reality. Then, in the middle of the decade, something exploded. It started in small, sweaty clubs in London and Manchester. It was loud, fast, and angry. It was punk rock. Bands like the Sex Pistols and the Clash weren't just playing music. They were lobbing sonic grenades at the establishment. The message was simple and electrifying. You don't need to be a virtuoso. You don't need a fancy record deal. All you need is 3 chords, a cheap guitar, and something to say. This DIY or do-it-yourself ethos was a call to arms for thousands of kids who felt disenfranchised and ignored. Suddenly, being in a band was not some far-off dream. It was an achievable goal. Darrell Bath was one of those kids. Born in London, he was a child of this era. He grew up soaking in the sounds that came before punk. The bluesy, swaggering rock of the Rolling Stones, the glam rock theatrics of David Bowie and T-Rex, and the raw proto-punk energy of bands like The Faces. These were his building blocks. When punk hit, it didn't erase those influences. It supercharged them. It gave them a new sense of urgency and aggression. For Darrell, the guitar wasn't just an instrument. It was a weapon against boredom, a passport out of a preordained life. As punk rock evolved through the late 70s and into the 80s, it splintered into 1,000 different subgenres. There was the political fury of anarcho-punk, the pop sensibilities of new wave, and the gothic gloom of post-punk. Darrell Bath's musical journey would navigate through this complex and ever-changing landscape. He wasn't a punk purist, tied to a single sound or ideology. He was a rock and roll lifer, absorbing everything around him and forging it into his own unique style. The scene he emerged from was gritty, authentic, and often dangerous. It was a world of squats, dive bars, and a hand-to-mouth existence, all in the name of music. It was a scene that celebrated authenticity above all else, but it was also one that romanticized the live fast, die young ethos. It was a world that could build you up and give you a purpose, but it could also chew you up and spit you out. For Darrell Bath, it would do both. Darrell Bath's musical story isn't one of a steady climb up the ladder of fame. It's more like a chaotic journey through the back alleys and smoky side rooms of rock and roll. He was never the main character in the blockbuster movie, but he was the scene-stealing supporting actor who made every film he was in better. His career began in the early 80s, cutting his teeth in a band called the Crybabies. They were a perfect distillation of his influences. Part punk, part glam, all greasy, booze-soaked rock and roll. They gigged relentlessly around London, building a small but devoted following. They were a musician's band, respected by their peers for their raw energy and Darrell's undeniable talent on the guitar. It was during this time that his reputation began to grow. He wasn't a flashy technical shredder. His genius lay in his feel, his timing, and his tone. He could make a cheap guitar sing, cry, and snarl. His playing was economical, yet deeply expressive. He knew that the notes you don't play are just as important as the ones you do. He had the swagger of Keith Richards, the melodic sense of Mick Ronson, and the raw power of Johnny Thunders, all filtered through his own unique London-bred sensibility. His talent did not go unnoticed. In the late 80s, he got one of his first big breaks, joining the glam punk outfit the Dogs d'Amour. The Dogs, led by the charismatic and poetic frontman Tyler, were on the cusp of mainstream success. Their music was a romantic, bohemian blend of rock, folk, and blues, and they had a passionate fan base. Darrell joined as a second guitarist, and his gritty, blues-inflected playing was a perfect foil for Tyler's more flamboyant style. He appeared on their hugely successful 1989 album, A Graveyard of Empty Bottles, a stripped-down, acoustic record that showcased a more vulnerable side of the band. His tasteful, soulful playing on that album is a masterclass in subtlety. However, the world of the Dogs d'Amour was also one of notorious excess. It was a band that lived its rock and roll mythology to the fullest, with all the glory and all the collateral damage that entailed. While Darrell's tenure with the band was musically fruitful, it also likely deepened the personal struggles with addiction that would plague him for the rest of his life. He would drift in and out of the band's orbit for years, a beloved but unreliable presence. After his initial stint with the Dogs, Darrell became a sought-after collaborator, a hired gun for a who's who of British rock royalty. He formed a band called Ian Hunter's Dirty Laundry with the legendary frontman of Mott the Hoople. He worked with Nicky Sudden of Swell Maps, a true pioneer of post-punk. He played alongside Honest John Plain of The Boys. His phone number was passed around like a secret password among those in the know. If you needed a guitarist who could bring authenticity, soul, and a bit of danger to your record, you called Darrell Bath. Perhaps his most significant and long-lasting collaboration was with the UK Subs. Led by the indefatigable Charlie Harper, The UK Subs are one of the original seminal British punk bands. They are lifers, a band that has never stopped touring, never compromised, and never sold out. Darrell joined the Subs in the mid-90s and became a key creative force in the band for several years. He co-wrote and played on albums like Quintessentials and Riot. His addition brought a new layer of musicality to the band's straight-ahead punk attack. His bluesy rock and roll sensibility broadened their sound without diluting their power. Charlie Harper, a man who has played with dozens of musicians over the band's long history, often spoke of Darrell as one of the most naturally gifted guitarists he had ever worked with. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, Darrell continued this pattern. He'd join a band, make a brilliant contribution, and then move on. He released solo material like the critically acclaimed album Saberjet, which was a raw, beautiful, and deeply personal collection of songs, but he never seemed able to, or perhaps never wanted to, play the music industry game. He was an artist, pure and simple. He wasn't interested in marketing and schmoozing and building a brand. He was interested in writing a great song, finding the perfect guitar tone, and playing a blistering live show. This purity was his greatest artistic strength, but it was also his biggest commercial weakness. He was a man out of time, a 70s rock and roll soul, navigating a world that increasingly valued image over substance. To understand Darrell Bath only through his discography is to miss the essence of the man. The music was brilliant, but it was the person behind the guitar who left a lasting impression on everyone he met. By all accounts, Darrell was a walking contradiction. On stage, he could be a feral, intense presence, lost in the storm of his own music. But off stage, he was often described as gentle, witty, and incredibly charming. He possessed a classic London cheeky-chappy charisma that could win over anyone. There are countless stories from fellow musicians that paint a picture of this complex man. Tyla, the frontman of the Dogs d'Amour, has spoken at length about Darrell's raw, untamed talent. He described him as a natural, someone who didn't need to think about playing the guitar. The music just flowed through him. Tyla also shared a poignant and rarely discussed insight into Darrell's creative process. He said that Darrell, despite his chaotic lifestyle, was a secret perfectionist in the studio. He would obsess over a single guitar part for hours, not in a technical way, but in a search for the right feeling. He was chasing a ghost, a perfect, soulful note that existed somewhere between his heart and his fingertips. This dedication to his craft stood in stark contrast to the chaos of his personal life. Darrell's battle with heroin addiction was an open secret in the music scene for decades. It was a tragic, classic rock and roll cliché, but for him and those who loved him, it was a very real and painful reality. His addiction made him unreliable. It cost him gigs, relationships, and opportunities. Bands would hire him for his genius, knowing full well that he might not show up for the next practice or the next tour date. It was a package deal. You got the brilliant guitarist, but you also got the addict. There's a heartbreaking anecdote from his time with the UK Subs that perfectly illustrates this duality. The band was set to play a major festival in Europe. It was a huge gig, a big payday, and a chance to play for thousands of people. Darrell was nowhere to be found. The band, frustrated but not entirely surprised, had to scramble to find a last-minute replacement. Weeks later, Darrell reappeared, full of apologies, with a sheepish grin on his face. He'd gone on a bender and lost track of time. The band was furious, but within minutes, Darrell had picked up a guitar, played a riff so beautiful and so perfect that it made everyone forget their anger, and he was forgiven. As Charlie Harper once put it, "You could never stay mad at Darrell. He was such a lovely bloke, and then he'd play the guitar and you'd just melt." This was the cycle of his life. His immense talent and personal charm bought him endless second chances. But the addiction was always there, a dark shadow that followed him everywhere. It wasn't a rock and roll affectation for him. It was a disease. It stemmed from a deep-seated pain and vulnerability that he often masked with his wit and swagger. One close friend remarked that Darrell used his guitar as both a shield and a megaphone. It was the only way he could truly express the turmoil inside him, the only language he was completely fluent in. In his later years, as his health declined, the struggle became more visible. He was often painfully thin, the years of hard living etched onto his face. Yet even then, the passion for music never waned. There are stories of him playing in small, dingy pubs for just a handful of people, pouring every last ounce of his energy into his performance. He'd be playing for beer money, living in squats or cheap rooms, but when he had a guitar in his hands, he was still a king. One of the most emotionally striking quotes about him came from a fan who saw him play one of his last gigs. He said he looked so fragile. You worried a stiff breeze would knock him over, but then he started playing, and he was a giant. The music made him strong. It was the ultimate paradox of his life. The very thing that gave him his voice was tied to a lifestyle that was slowly, inexorably silencing him. The story of Darrell Bath is inevitably tangled up with the dark side of rock and roll. His struggles with addiction and his eventual death in poverty raise uncomfortable questions about the music industry and the culture that surrounds it. It's easy to romanticize the live fast, die young cliché, to see it as a necessary byproduct of creative genius. But Darrell's story forces us to look past the romance and see the grim reality. Was he simply a casualty of his own choices? Or was he a victim of a scene that, at times, seems to actively enable self-destruction? The truth, as is often the case, is likely somewhere in the complex gray area in between. The punk and rock and roll scenes of the 80s and 90s certainly didn't invent addiction, but they often provided a fertile ground for it to grow. It was a culture that valued authenticity, and for many, authentic became synonymous with living on the edge. The use of hard drugs was not just tolerated, it was sometimes seen as a badge of honor, a sign that you were a real artist, uncorrupted by commercialism. For someone like Darrell, who was already battling personal demons, this environment could be incredibly dangerous. It created a feedback loop. The music celebrated a lifestyle of excess, and living that lifestyle fueled the raw, pained emotions that made the music so powerful. He was trapped in his own image, the doomed rock and roll poet. It's a compelling narrative, but a hellish one to live out. There's also a historical debate to be had about the economic realities of being a cult musician. Darrell was revered by his peers. His name was spoken with respect in every rock and roll pub in London, but respect doesn't pay the rent. He existed in a precarious middle ground, too famous to be anonymous, but not famous enough to be financially secure. He played on successful albums, but as a hired gun or a band member, he likely saw very little of the profits. The music industry, particularly in the pre-streaming era, was notoriously top-heavy. The money flowed to the record labels and the handful of artists at the very top of the pyramid. For a working musician like Darrell, even one with a legendary reputation, life was often a constant hustle. This leads to the most controversial and heartbreaking aspect of his story, his final years. He was in poor health, struggling with the long-term effects of his addiction, and living in dire poverty. The rock and roll community that had celebrated his talent for decades was largely absent in his time of greatest need. There were, of course, individuals who tried to help. Friends and former bandmates would give him money, a place to stay, or a gig, but there was no systemic safety net. The industry that had profited from his talent had no mechanism for taking care of its own when they fell on hard times. When he died in September 2021 at the age of 54, the news spread not through official press releases, but through a sad, shocked ripple on social media among those who knew him and loved his music. The mainstream music press, which will dedicate pages to the passing of far lesser talents, was almost entirely silent. There were no grand tributes, no acknowledgments of his vast contribution. He had become invisible. His death was a quiet, lonely affair, a stark contrast to the loud, vibrant music he had given the world. It was a tragic indictment of an industry that worships success but has little time for those it leaves behind. Darrell Bath gave everything he had to rock and roll, and in the end, it felt like rock and roll had forgotten him. When a musician like Darrell Bath passes away in relative obscurity, it's easy to dismiss their story as a failure. No hit singles, no gold records, no sold-out stadium tours. By the conventional metrics of the music industry, his career could be seen as a series of missed opportunities. But to measure Darrell Bath's significance by chart positions is to fundamentally misunderstand his legacy. His importance isn't found on a sales sheet. It's found in the grooves of the records he played on and in the hearts of the musicians he inspired. His primary legacy is that of the guitarist's guitarist. This is a sacred title in the world of music. It means that your true audience, the people who truly understand the depth of your talent, are your fellow players. For every fan who knew his name, there were 10 guitarists who studied his licks, who tried to capture his tone, who revered his effortless blend of swagger and soul. He was a keeper of the flame, a direct link back to the foundational rock and roll of the 60s and 70s, filtered through the aggressive energy of punk. In an era of increasing technical complexity and digital polish, Darrell Bath was a testament to the power of raw feeling. He reminded everyone that the most important thing in music isn't how many notes you can play, but how much heart you can put into the few notes you choose. His story also serves as a crucial, if painful, historical document of a certain type of musician that is now all but extinct. He was an analog soul in a digital world. He came from a time when a musician's reputation was built not on social media followers, but on their ability to walk into a sweaty, packed club and blow the roof off the place. His life highlights the immense gap between artistic respect and financial success. It's a sobering lesson for any aspiring musician. Talent and integrity are not guarantees of a comfortable life. His struggle throws the harsh economics of the music industry into sharp relief, forcing us to ask why a culture can consume an artist's soul and then discard the vessel when it's no longer profitable. Perhaps his most enduring and most tragic significance is as a symbol of the lost heroes of rock and roll. For every Kurt Cobain or Amy Winehouse who struggles with addiction are chronicled and mythologized, there are 100 Darrell Baths who fight the same battles in silence and die without fanfare. His story matters because it represents all of them. It speaks for the countless brilliant broken musicians who gave their lives to their art but never got their due. There is an incredibly powerful and little-known quote from a fellow punk legend who, upon hearing of Darrell's death, posted a simple message online. He wrote, "The world is full of people who can play guitar. There are very few people who can make a guitar talk. Darrell was one of them. We've lost a true poet of the sixth string." This perfectly encapsulates his legacy. He wasn't just a player. He was a communicator. His music was his language, a raw, honest dialect that spoke of love, loss, defiance, and despair. His legacy is a complicated one. It's a testament to the raw, visceral power of rock and roll. It's a heartbreaking cautionary tale about addiction. But most of all, it's a tribute to the unsung hero. His story is a powerful reminder to look past the frontman, to listen more closely to the quiet one standing in the shadows, because that is often where the real magic lies. He represents all the brilliant musicians who burn brightly in small dark clubs, who pour their entire souls into their art for little more than a round of applause and a few beers. Darrell Bath may not have his name in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but his spirit lives on in every gritty guitar riff, in every dive bar where a band is playing their hearts out, in every musician who chooses authenticity over fame. He was a true believer in the redemptive power of a loud guitar. His life was messy, tragic, and far too short, but the music he left behind is pure, honest, and immortal. It's the sound of a man who, despite everything, never stopped trying to make his guitar talk. And for those of us who were lucky enough to hear it, it was a language we will never forget.